Welcome back to Beyond the Sermon for our series, Hard to Believe. Today we're going to be talking about Magrey's sermon that he just preached on the nature of God, basically, these three ideas of God being omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent. So everywhere, knowing all things, and being all powerful. So we're going to kind of dive into that idea today with Magrey. And again, I'm Matt Hotho, the Director of Production and Online Engagement. So, Magrey, where did this idea of the omnis kind of come from?
Well, it's interesting to note that in the history of Christian theology, the history of Christian thought, it has been a constant iteration and development. So in other words, the first two things we talked about in the first 2 weeks about the Trinity and the Incarnation were fundamental. They were foundational within the first several hundred centuries of the church. But all it did was create the canvas on which additional color and insight needed to eventually be added in order to make our idea of God and the Christian faith even more relevant to who we are. So the idea of God being all-knowing and all-powerful and all-present were not immediately present in the church's understanding. And I think that's an important thing to remember, just this fundamental idea that theology is allowed to expand, it's allowed to iterate, it's even allowed to change and do course corrections. That's happened all throughout Christian history, which gives us permission to do that individually. So some of the things that we have learned and have been ingrained in us, maybe from our formative years, I talked about my early years in the faith, we can go through processes of choosing what is still essential to us from our earliest understanding, and then enhancing it, packaging it with new ideas. That's the work of the Holy Spirit, I believe, especially if we do it in community. So the idea of the omnis is, in the grand context of church history, a fairly recent sort of notion within the last 1,000 years, I suppose. So you probably have some further detail on where those came from.
Yeah, so actually, you talk about how theology grows and changes with us, right? And when I went to college at Florida Southern, in my senior year, one of the things all religion majors take is Doctrine of God with Wade Willis. It's called DOG. I mean, it's like short.
I don't know which of those words and what you just said is the most imposing of that phrase. Doctrine, God, or Wade Willis.
Right.
Go ahead.
So it's kind of like almost a capstone course for seniors in religion. And Wade's major thesis that he wrote his doctoral thesis on is that Christian theology took a turn in the 13th century with Thomas Aquinas' publishing of this thing called the Summa Theologica, where Thomas lays out this idea of the omnis, basically. The omnis didn't exist before the 13th century. It's not found in the Bible. It's not found in a lot of the early church fathers. But Thomas, kind of using this new scientific or scholastic way of doing theology, thought, well, if God is this first cause, this first thing, then all of these things have to then naturally come from that. And the things that came from it was that God was all-powerful, all-knowing, everywhere, right? And these other things too, like God is immutable, God is unchanging, God is impassible, God can't suffer, right? So in the 13th century, we get this understanding that God is all of these omnis. And I think we assume that means that, well, that is just church understanding, like the Trinity, like the nature of Jesus. But I think it's helpful to realize that that's not what St. Thomas is doing necessarily. I mean, he's doing that, but it's not, it doesn't have the same weight as a creedal statement.
Right.
Like what we talked about last week, like Jesus being fully human and fully divine, or God being three persons in one.
Yet at the same time, it is still rooted in the earliest notions of who God is, according to the earliest church thinkers. So even though the omnis and those qualities are relatively recent developments, they're still rooted in, the thing that comes to mind is a formula that Anselm came up with, one of the early Christian philosophers, who conceived of God with this phrase: God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, which is a nightmare to diagram grammatically. Syntactically, it's really complicated. But basically what it's saying is that if you can think of something greater than any attribute or characteristic, then that's not God. But the moment you hit a limit where nothing greater than that quality can be conceived with our human understanding, that's what defines God.
Yeah.
So if you think of a God who is pretty smart, or even the most smart, or infinitely smart, then that's getting close. But God having vast, unknowable smartness, that's God, according to Anselm. So you take that and you create a matrix of all the qualities that we've talked about. God is that than which nothing greater can even be conceived.
Yeah. And so you end up with this God that's very removed from human experience in some ways, right?
Right.
And we'll get to that, I think, a little bit later in our conversation about some of the consequences of that and some of the ways that the horrors of the 20th century sort of called that to the carpet.
Right.
But let's stay with this theological idea, kind of like we did last week, where there's things downstream of claiming that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. When we understand the nature of God, what's downstream of the nature of God in our theology?
What are the consequences of that belief?
Sort of what is impacted by our belief in who God is? I think of free will. Right?
Yes.
If God is ultra powerful,
right,
how do you then suss out the idea of human free will, right? And I think we come into some issues that kind of separate Methodists from certain streams of Christian thought because of what we believe about how God's free will works.
Yeah.
Right?
Those are really important questions to ask, because the project of doing theology is not just figuring out what to believe, but it's also figuring out what are the consequences of that belief.
Right.
What impact does it make on how we understand other things, including ourselves, the realities of the world, and most importantly, human behavior in the right and best ways to live? So the first two omnis are fairly straightforward. I would say there's not a whole lot of downstream impact in the idea that God is all-knowing or that God is all-present. Those provide more comfort than challenge. It's really the omnipotence part that really rubs up against and is very consequential in the way it gives us responsibility or not in our interactions with others. So yes, even through recent history in the last couple of centuries, there were spirited conversations about the omnipotence of God versus the capacity of human free will. And not to simplify it, but for us as United Methodists who are in the legacy of John Wesley was clearly in one of those camps. He really believed in what was called the Arminian way of believing that free will is an inherent, not just gift from God, but an inherent quality of being human. So the argument is, if humans have any power at all, which is what's inherent to the idea of free will, that means that God doesn't have all power. Because if God had all power, like I said in my sermon, then we don't have any power, and that just makes us puppets. Right. So there are legitimate biblical, theological, historical reasons for that. But on the other hand was John Calvin. And not to set it up as too much of an opposition here, but his views were very different. The Reformed theology of John Calvin really needed to believe in the omnipotence and the omnicausality of God, that not only does God have all power, but God causes all things. So the idea of predestination, of God foreknowing who's going to choose God and who's not, very clearly in the Calvinist camp. And so that's one example of what you're talking about. If you go too far with omnipotence, it impacts our views of human free will. And the moment we compromise the idea of human choice or human free will, that just invites all sorts of passivity on our part to not feel like we have any agency or responsibility to correct the things that are wrong in the world.
Yeah, so then what is the distinctly Methodist kind of view of free will and maybe how we have agency?
Right.
Related to the nature of God.
Well, John Wesley found this way through the center to say, yes, on the one hand, humans have free will, but that free will that we have is itself a sign of God's power for us and as a gift from God. The only reason we have power at all is that God has empowered us out of God's power. That's one essential piece, and that's the foundation for prevenient grace, the idea that God has been working in us to give us the power to choose one way or another. Without it, we couldn't choose. But the other idea is a reconception of God's power, that if God had all the power and we didn't have any, then God's power is basically coercive, basically is the master hand, and we're just the puppets.
Mm-hmm.
But a more modern Wesleyan view would say that God's power is not coercive, but persuasive.
Mm-hmm.
That God's power is in God's ability to convince us of the right thing to do, to persuade us to choose the right way, to woo us, to lure us, and that in fact, God is the most persuasive influence in the world. Back to Anselm's definition, nothing is greater than the persuasiveness of God, than God's power, than the power that God demonstrates. God is ultimately, infinitely persuasive and influential, and, this is both and at the same time, we have to choose to cooperate with that persuasive power or not. So that's at the heart of John Wesley. The classic phrase for John Wesley is grace with responsibility, that we have been given by God's grace the gift of free will. That free will comes with it a responsibility to cooperate, to co-create, to participate in the persuasive power of God.
Which sort of gets to the threefold understanding of grace then within the Methodist
Absolutely.
tradition. I mean, you can't go too far in a theological conversation in Methodism before stumbling across the threefold understanding of grace, which I think is probably the biggest gift that Methodism can give to our understandings, right?
Prevenient grace, which works within us before we realize it. Justifying grace, which allows us to be in a right relationship with God. And then sanctifying grace, which works throughout our entire lives to slowly form us in the image of Jesus.
Yeah. Which, if we can do a quick moment to contrast that then with what maybe other traditions might have. I mean, prevenient grace in and of itself is why we baptize infants.
Right. That's
Right.
true. That's true.
We believe that God, in some way, actually, maybe omnipotent, but I don't think that's helpful language to use, but God's so powerful that God is at work in someone's life before we acknowledge it, right? And therefore we can baptize a baby, and that baby doesn't have to say, I accept Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and
That's
Savior.
right. That's right. And inherent to the act of baptism is both things being true, that God is the primary actor and God is the primary worker of grace in that child's life, but there's a participatory element. There's a co-creating element in that moment, that it is the parents on behalf of the child. It is the congregation speaking in support of the family. It is the witness of the entire church, both past and future, that is in that moment to pledge, to vow, to be with God in the ongoing work of that child's life.
Yeah. So then, as we kind of go to the final point of our conversation before we wrap up, I want to talk about the omnis in the 20th century and how some of the horrors of the 20th century, World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, Hiroshima, Jim Crow laws, how those have really called God to the carpet in some ways. And we've had this whole slew of theologians who have risen up that have gone, who is God if these things can still happen? And I realize I don't want to give away your sermon for next week about suffering and evil.
Sure.
But in light of the fact that Jürgen Moltmann passed away 2 days ago, who was a influential theologian for Wade Willis, for me, and sort of some of my early theological thinkings, his primary book, one of his most famous books, is called The Crucified God. And in that book, he makes the claim that essentially God died, but not in the new atheist way of saying God's dead, but more of God went so far in wanting to understand the human experience of suffering that God died on the cross. Therefore, when we experience death, suffering, loss, pain in our own lives, we don't have a God who's omnipotent, who stands separate from that. We have a God who is chosen in God's own self to experience that for God's self. And therefore, when we pray to God, when we confess to God, when we yearn for God to be with us, God's response is, I'm right here. Right?
Moltmann was a giant of the faith. His theological contributions will form generations of the church, generations to come. The line from Moltmann that I remember hearing in seminary that I've never let go of is that when Jesus was on the cross, it was not God being concealed, it was God being revealed. And it plays to this hymn in Philippians 2, that we often read it as though Jesus regarded God, equality with God as something to be exploited, he became a human and died on the cross. that word though can also be translated as because. Because Jesus was God, he became human and became obedient and died on the cross. Moltmann was significant, singular in his move towards helping us see God in that way, but also at the same time, just one in a long line of significant theological thinkers that were simply practicing integrating the orthodoxy that we've inherited with the realities of human experience at the time. I mean, when you think about it, even all the way back to Hebrew times, the Old Testament times, every time there was crisis in the human experience, that made the circle of human reality incongruous with the theological beliefs at the time, which meant that theology had to grow and expand in order to meet the crisis of the moment. So that's why the whole Exodus theology is so important. Exile theology. In the first century, the destruction of the temple established a great deal in the theology we see in Revelation. Anytime there's crisis happening in the world, or particularly in the church, there has been an expansion of theology. And it's painful, not just because of the crisis, but because it requires us to see God in a broader way. So when you think about World War II and the Holocaust, it set the stage for a person like Moltmann to say, how do we incorporate what we have known about Christian theology into this new reality that is not big enough to encompass our experience of human suffering? So the idea of God suffering with us was the natural extension of really a long line of theologies. So, and even more recent than Moltmann, we have suffering and crises and inequalities today. So that's given rise to newer theologies over the last few decades. Black liberation theology, to talk about the experience of being enslaved and modern day racism. You've got feminist and womanist theology to talk about the inequalities in our genders. You've got queer theology to talk about the exclusion of LGBTQ persons. You've got a liberation theology that started in the oppression of Latin American communities. And the list could go on and on and on.
Actually, I heard a podcast the other day from a theologian with cerebral palsy.
How about that?
Who does disability theology.
Disability theology
is really
a growing front. Absolutely. Yeah. And as much as these might be controversial for people who look at it in a narrow kind of way, it's just an extension of the whole enterprise of theology that reminds us that we are grounded in the essentials that started in the first few centuries, the Trinity and the Incarnation. But over time, 2,000 years of history, a lot of things have happened which not only invites us, but forces us to expand our theology, to diversify our views, so that the unknowability of God can be known in the realities of human experience.
I think that's a great place to stop for this week, because next week we are going to dive into that very distinct issue of suffering and where God is in suffering. As you can see, I mean, theology grows from experience. And maybe next week we'll talk about the Wesleyan quadrilateral.
Yeah, why not?
How for us as Wesleyans, experience does play a part in our theological thinking, you know, what we've experienced and how our lives have been shaped by that. So thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.